The late Middle Ages. Our objectives are: 1. Identify the overwhelming number of disastrous forces that challenged Europe in the 14th century. And 2. Explain how European rulers re-established the centralized power of monarchical governments. Now, really, we need to begin this phase of history discussing the Black Death, really one of the major disasters of the 14th century as we close out the medieval period. And, of course, this disastrous disease swept through Europe at this time, taking many with it. And really, the name Black Death was given it because of the death toll. It really seems to be somewhere around 1/3, some have even said up to half of the European population killed. And now here's one quote that was said during that period: "Father abandoned child, wife husband, no one could be found to bury the dead, for money or friendship." That quote kind of gives an image of what this really looked like and how disastrous it might have been. That really people kind of transitioned into a survival mode where the kinds of relationships that we normally see in human life are abandoned. Father abandoning child, wife, husband, it didn't matter. No one cared anymore. Everyone had to flee and run and survive on their own. In fact, the next line is, I think, most disturbing. "No one could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship," meaning that people didn't want to touch it. People didn't want to be near it, which led to actually the spread of the disease even more, because you ended up just having bodies strewn all over the place in Europe, particularly in the urban centers. So really this plague spreads, and it spreads in what it seems to be along trade routes and port cities. But really the bubonic plague is believed to be really the core of this Black Death, and was the most common form of it. Now, it's argued, and probably most likely, that fleas carried this bacterium on the backs of rats on merchant ships going from the east across the Mediterranean into Italian port cities. The plague spread through ports, like I said, in southern Italy, along trade routes into Europe. So we can see through the movement of the disease, it spreads along those trade routes, which gives some indication that perhaps these are the people that were carrying it. And it was along this route that it was spreading through merchandise, which is kind of ironic that as medieval Europe is growing and blossoming, it's also inevitably bringing to itself its own destruction through its economic expansion. So, like I said, some people say 1/4 to 1/2. It's unclear, but it's for sure somewhere between 30 and 50%. That is, that half of the population, 1 in 2 people, die from this disease. Now, of course, these people at the time don't know anything about the concept of bacteria. They don't know the concept of microbials. And so the question becomes, why? Where did this happen? Why is this occurring? So it led to all kinds of questions. Is this a punishment from God? Is this the apocalypse, the end of time? Is this the wrath of the devil attacking us? What have we done? What have we done? Who is evil among us that's causing this? And so many lashed out in fear, particularly against Jews and other people who were vulnerable, witches, for example. In fact, some people even believed that the Jews, using an old Jewish libel, believed that they were poisoning the wells of the community, and that's where this disease was coming from. And so we see an explosion of anti-Semitism, where they're capturing and blaming the Jews, and in fact, in many cases, burning them at the stake, attempting to free themselves from this disastrous events in Europe. Now, the economic consequences are kind of mixed. Here in the picture, before we move on to the economic consequences, I think it's important to note here that here's depicted the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse treading over medieval people. Now, one of them is disease, and so many people believe the apocalypse had really come upon them, and this was the disease was this horseman. But in any case, severe economic consequences really had led to kind of a mixed bag for Europe. Trade declined, of course, and you had a dramatic shortage of workers. But there's a positive note here. That is that with a dramatic decline in the availability of workers, that means that you have a dramatic rise in the price of labor, right? Supply and demand. There's fewer workers, therefore the workers are wanted more, and therefore the workers can then demand a higher pay. What we end up seeing through this shift is that many peasants were freed from their serfdom. They no longer were bound to the land, that they were no longer indebted to their lords, that they could move on, they could go other places, they could negotiate for their labor. Now, of course, the hierarchical structure of Europe is not going to like this, and they're going to resist this, and they're going to try to say, no, you're going to get paid what you were paid before. But really, in some senses, some have argued that this is the culminating factor that transitions Europe out of the medieval period and into the early modern Renaissance period, where you have an elevated lower class that are pushing into a kind of merchant, budding middle class with more economic prosperity. We also see at this time a decline in church power. You have a series of problems that led to the decline in the church's political position, particularly all the scandals and all the problems that existed. Many people were just tired of dealing with it, tired of hearing it, tired of seeing the pomp, tired of seeing the corruption. And so we see really a decline in that power, a decline from those glorious political days of Pope Innocent III. Particularly, we see a major political shift with the rise of Avignon. That is, the European kings had really grown unwilling to accept the papal claims of supremacy by the end of the 13th century. Kings were tired of hearing it. Kings were tired of hearing the popes claiming that they have all supreme authority and everyone had to listen to them. And so Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV really hit it hard. They had a huge clash over this same issue. And there was all sorts of issues connected to taxation on clergy, whether the clergy in their land and their territories could be taxed. I mean, if you'll recall, church lands were somewhere around 1/3 of all European territory. That's a lot of rich land and a lot of taxation. And so, the kings, of course, are going to be pretty upset about this. The French king, for example, wants control and wants this economic gain and taxation from these regions. So the French king invades Italy and invades Rome and kidnaps the king. The king, the pope, the papal monarch. He seizes him and starts bringing him back to France. But guess what happens? He dies on the way. And so when they get to France, they elect their own pope. And so Philip IV engineered the election of a Frenchman, Clement V, as Pope of 1305. He's kind of like a crony or a puppet for the French king. Now, of course, this papal throne is in Avignon, no longer in Rome. And so here we have a pope that is in the line of Peter. Remember, because we need apostolic succession, and he's elected in France and remains in France. Now, many people then later described this as a Babylonian captivity. Often academics refer to it as the Avignon papacy, the papacy that existed in Avignon. But the idea of the Babylonian captivity connects back to the biblical story about how the Jews were brought into exile in Babylon, but one day would return back to their home, to Jerusalem. And so this was the connection, the kind of idea that the Pope and the papacy has left Rome, but maybe one day it will return. But of course, this was not without its controversy as well. Now, one Petrarch really describes what it was like in Avignon, what the papacy was like. We end up seeing this idea. This is his words. Here reign the successors of the poor fishermen of Galilee. They have strangely forgotten their origin. I am astounded to see these men loaded with gold and clad in purple, boasting of the spoils of princes and nations. So here he's criticizing their wealth. He's criticizing their consumption and focus on gold and power and kingship. When here he kind of draws a parallel, saying, hey, you know what? This is kind of ironic that these are the successors of the poor fishermen of Galilee, of Peter, the uneducated fisherman who is in the line of Christ Jesus. So this is an ironic criticism of the papacy. Of course, the papal Roman tradition was not really much different, but Avignon seemed to be a bit different. Now, of course, you have to remember that this is all going on at the same time as the Black Death. So you have disease and death going on in that sense, but you also at the same time have this papal controversy where the Pope is no longer in Rome. But things get even worse because a great schism occurs, and its aftermath has dramatic implications on the faith of the people. So Gregory XI, the Avignon Pope, he dies, and he led to an election through intimidation of an Italian Pope. What had actually happened was that Gregory XI had gone down to visit in Italy, and he died while there, and it led to the election of a new pope. Well, the Italians were like, we need an Italian pope again. We're not having a French pope. Forget this. And so they, through intimidation, forced an Italian pope to be elected. Well, then a group of French cardinals says, man, that's not right. You're, forcing the election of an Italian pope. And so the French cardinals elect an alternative French pope. And so now you have two popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome, and both claim apostolic succession. Now everyone's like, what the heck is going on? No one knows really what is the deal. And so this phase of history is known as the Great Schism, that is the split between what is going on with the papacy. Multiple popes at the same time from 1378 to 1417. In fact, there was even a council established where they deposed both those popes and established another pope. The problem is that the councils technically aren't allowed to do that. So then you have three popes, all with apostolic succession. Which one do you worship, that you're devoted to, that you follow? This is the issue. During an age when you have disease running rampant, you believe it is the apocalypse, you believe it's the end of the world, and now you have three popes. Some of these must be antichrist. Some of these must be demonic people. So many people saw in this, of course, an uncertainty, especially at this time, because if you received sacraments from a false pope, then they were no good. So what if you received baptism for your child or last rites, and it was the wrong pope, and it was the wrong pope's bishops? Then it was no good, and you would go to hell. This was a big deal and a hard decision for many to make. Now, the Pope was widely believed to be the true leader of Christendom, and this was the problem. Souls were endangered because if it was the false Pope, you would go to hell. So each Pope denounced the other as an antichrist. Of course, we would expect this. So each claims that they are the true Pope, and the others are antichrist. So you can kind of see how this might be kind of difficult for the average kind of Christian, and the average Christian would not necessarily be educated and really couldn't read, write, or anything like that. And so who are you going to pick? I mean, that's a problem. Now, of course, many voices emerged criticizing this. One example would be John Huss. John Huss criticized the church and the clergy for its excessive power and wealth that had led to this phase. And now, of course, John Huss ends up getting burned at the stake. That's what the picture here is of, burned at the stake as a heretic for daring to say that the Pope was corrupt and that the power and wealth of this period was problematic. I dare say that even many good Christian Catholic people today would be burned at the stake as heretics for criticizing the papacy at this time. Now, At this same time, you have the context of the disease and Black Death. You have the context of the Avignon Papacy, but you also now have the 100 Years' War going on. Now, the 100 Years' War is a conflict between England and France, infamous for its brutality. War and political instability really dominated this period, and it was a violent struggle over land and territory. And so really the war begins between King Edward III of England, who declared war on Philip. And it stretched from 1337 to 1453. Now, it wasn't constant war. It wasn't a perpetual state of war. There were phases and periods of heightened battle and not, but it was still a war continuously for 100 years. So the 100 Years' War proved to be an important turning point in the nature of warfare in general. But you can see kind of the tumultuous time, and that's kind of the picture I want you to get, that there's the disease going on, there's the religious controversy, and there's this massive war between England and France. So, of course, the context for the average person is, man, this world is falling apart. And this is really the birth pains, as it were, of the Renaissance and the early modern world. It's through this pain, through this suffering, that we end up seeing that new world emerge. Now, the shifts in technology really are the introduction of peasant foot soldiers, not knights, into the battle. Traditionally, in the medieval period, you would have knights on horseback with armor fighting. But here we see an introduction of peasant foot soldiers. And this, of course, is a decisive shift in the battle, a decisive shift in the way that warfare was fought, and leads to, ultimately, some serious losses in battle, yes, but also a contextualization for future warfare as the average person joins in. Now, technologically, these peasants were armed with the English longbow, which was a massive innovation. It was much longer than the normal crossbow, or the traditional bow. I mean, most of the French were using crossbows at the time, because you would get a lot of blunt force. However, the English longbow, often as tall as a man, 6 feet sometimes, had greater range due to its greater force and pullback, and of course then a more rapid firing speed. And this would allow for greater force as it's striking its opponent. And of course, I mean, really what we end up seeing is that in battles, because of its distance, you could have an entire archery group stand far back from the army and just shoot and shoot and shoot, and the French couldn't reach them. So this is a major shift in that warfare. Now, everyone then needs to acknowledge one central figure that really encapsulates some of the major problems during this period, religiously and politically, with the 100 Years' War. And this figure is Joan of Arc, or Jeanne. Now, she is a French peasant. She's born in 1412, and she ultimately turned the tide of the war. I mean, it's a fascinating story. It's been told over and over again because of what's fascinating about it. Now, she claims that she experienced visions, angels speaking to her. And she came to believe that her favorite saint had commanded her to free France, that she was supposed to, charged by God, rally the French troops and to attack the English. So she really ended up becoming a rallying point for the French. It's unclear whether she had any military skill or whether she was, skilled in any sort of sense or had any kind of religious true experience that other people could kind of tangibly grab onto. But whatever it might be, it was a dark time for the French, and so she becomes kind of this beacon of hope and light for many of them as they're looking for hope. And they see in her the divine's rescue of the people. And so they're turning to her to be an intermediary between the divine and their military campaigns. Now, ultimately, she gets into a lot of trouble. A couple different factors. One, she dressed as a man. She wore men's armor. And so this, of course, is a problem in this kind of strict, straight-lace medieval society. And she's ultimately captured by the English in the long run. She's captured and sold technically to the English. Now, it's unclear, but it seems that the French were unwilling to pay the bounty. This was typical in medieval politics. Someone wealthy, someone important was kidnapped, and then they were sold back to them for coin. It seems that the French were unwilling to pay for her to go to France. And so England was like, sure, we'll take your rallying point. We'll take her and we'll put her on trial. And so the English put her on inquisition and charged her with witchcraft. And ultimately she's burned at the stake. So the point is that the war was brutal and it cost many, many lives. It's interesting on the case of Joan of Arc that she ends up becoming a saint in the long run. I think it's fascinating that the Catholic Church kills their own saint, believing that she's a heretic. That should tell us that the line between heresy and sainthood is paper thin. So just to kind of get an idea of the eccentric kind of lay piety experience at this time. So in general, the war was brutal and, of course, leading to new technological innovations and, of course, loss of life. Now, at the very end of the war, you see the introduction of gunpowder and cannons, which is going to be a huge shifting point for the Western world. So just to kind of recap then, the objective was, 1, identify the overwhelming number of disastrous forces that challenged Europe in the 14th century. Black Death, Avignon papacy and papal conflict, and the 100 Years' War. A tumultuous time, to be sure. And the second, explain how European rulers reestablished the centralized powers of monarchical governments. For that one, take a little closer look at the reading, and of course that will be explored through the 100 Years' War and that attempt to establish massive new monarchical governments.